Greg Abbott gave police the power to arrest on suspicion alone, no warrant, no judge, just a look. Soon, innocent Americans disappeared, detained for their accent, their skin, or saying nothing at all. Jasmine Crockett uncovered a $24 million scheme tied to detention quotas and Abbott's allies. What they called border security was a profit machine built on fear. Was this ever about protecting Texas, or was it about profiting from cages? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. Under the blinding lights of the chamber, the hearing began like a storm breaking over Washington. The rows of lawmakers sat rigid, cameras burning red at the back of the room, waiting to beam every second into millions of homes. At the witness table, Greg Abbott adjusted his tie with practiced arrogance, his lips pressed into a faint smirk that suggested the outcome was already his. Then the doors opened, and Jasmine Crockett entered. Her stride was firm, her gaze steady, and the noise in the chamber died at once. She walked directly toward the center, eyes locked on Abbott, the clash inevitable, her presence demanding silence before she even spoke. She sat across from him, sliding the folder onto the table like a weapon waiting to be unsheathed. The chairman's gavel struck, echoing through the chamber. This hearing will come to order. Abbott leaned toward his microphone, his voice slow, rehearsed, and heavy with self-importance. The people of Texas are facing an invasion, he declared. Families, communities, our entire way of life are under siege. That is why I ordered buses to carry migrants north. It is not cruelty, it is compassion, a humanitarian measure to protect Texans from chaos. His words hung in the air, polished for the cameras but hollow to those who had seen the cost. Jasmine's hand moved to her microphone, her voice sharp, cutting, impossible to ignore. Humanitarian, she said, her tone rising like steel against glass. Governor Abbott, you are not protecting anyone. You are politicizing suffering. You are turning mothers and children into cheap cargo, loading them onto buses as if their lives are nothing but props for your campaign. The chamber stirred, a wave of gasps and murmurs breaking across the rows. Her words cut through the scripted calm, setting the room alight with the first sparks of real conflict. Abbott's face tightened, his smirk twisting into a snarl. He jabbed a finger toward her, his voice louder now, dripping with fury. Don't be fooled by her performance, he spat. This woman isn't here for justice. She's here to divide. She's nothing more than a colored agitator trying to make herself famous at Texas's expense. The insult struck like a slap, echoing through the chamber in brutal clarity. Gasps erupted, lawmakers shifting in their seats, some recoiling in shock while others stared wide-eyed at the audacity of his words. The silence that followed was heavier than the insult itself. Cameras zoomed closer, capturing every flicker of expression, every beat of sweat. Abbott leaned back, certain he had landed the blow, his chest puffed with triumph. But Jasmine didn't flinch. Her eyes remained locked on him, steady, unshaken, carrying the weight of generations who had faced worse and refused to bow. The chamber felt it, the shift in power, the raw electricity of a battle no one could script. The hearing had only just begun, and already it was a war. The sting of Abbott's insult still lingered in the air, sharp and raw, when Jasmine leaned forward with a calm precision that made the entire chamber freeze. She did not flinch. She did not rise in anger. She reached for the folder in front of her, every movement deliberate, every second calculated. The snap of the clasp echoed like a gunshot in the silence. Papers slid across the polished wood, their edges crisp and unforgiving. Let's deal with facts, she said, her voice carrying through the room like a blade slicing through smoke. This is Senate Bill 4, your law, the one that lets state police arrest anyone they think looks undocumented, without federal review, without accountability. The words landed like a gavel strike, and even the cameras seemed to lean closer, their lenses hungry for the truth spilling into the open. The room shifted uneasily. Some lawmakers fidgeted in their seats, the buzz of staffers' whispers building like static. Jasmine's hand did not tremble as she lifted a new document, this one raised high for every lawmaker and every television screen across the nation to see. Her tone sharpened, gathering weight with every word. And here's what your law has done in just 2 weeks, she declared, her voice rising above the restless murmurs. 37 American citizens, Latino, brown-skinned, born in Texas, locked up, stripped of their dignity, treated like criminals in their own country. This isn't speculation. This is the ACLU report, filed 3 days ago. The words detonated in the chamber, sending shockwaves down each row. Conversations halted mid-breath. Faces stiffened, some pale with disbelief, others red with outrage. Gasps rippled from the gallery, echoing like distant thunder. Reporters' pens scratched furiously against notepads, knowing this moment would set headlines ablaze by nightfall. A congressman from the back row leaned forward, his jaw clenched, while a woman near the aisle covered her mouth in disbelief. The numbers weren't abstract, they were names, families, neighbors. Jasmine's delivery made them more than statistics. They were human beings, caught and broken under the weight of a law cloaked in false righteousness. The chamber's walls, thick with history, seemed to absorb the gravity of her accusation, as if the room itself knew this was no ordinary clash of politics. Jasmine leaned into her microphone again, her eyes locked on Abbott like a predator that had just found its mark. Her voice cut through the air with the cold clarity of a verdict. When skin color becomes the reason someone gets stopped, when brown families are dragged off the streets, not because of what they've done, but because of what they look like, that's not law, she said, every syllable etched with defiance. That is terror, dressed up as policy. The words cracked through the hearing like lightning splitting the night sky. For a moment, no one moved. The tension was so thick it seemed to choke the oxygen out of the room. Then in a burst of rage, Abbott slammed his palm against the table, his face contorted with fury. He shoved himself toward the microphone, his voice booming so loudly the chamber's microphones strained under the weight of his roar. "Lies!" he thundered, his words rattling across the room. "Crockett is lying to the American people. She's a fraud, a traitor to Texas. She doesn't represent the citizens who built this state. She represents criminals flooding our border." His finger stabbed the air in her direction, his body trembling with indignation. But the more he shouted, the more the mask slipped. What he wanted to sound like righteous anger came across instead as desperation, the outburst of a man who felt control slipping through his hands. And so the chamber held its breath, caught between Jasmine's unyielding clarity and Abbott's furious denial. Every camera captured the sweat beading on his forehead, the way his jaw tightened, the flicker of panic behind his eyes. Every viewer at home could feel the line that had just been drawn in blood and fire, truth on one side of the table and rage on the other. The drama had reached its boiling point, but deep down, everyone in the room knew it was only the beginning of a fight that would scorch everything in its path. The air in the hearing room hadn't yet recovered from the violent rupture of Abbott's voice when Jasmine moved again slowly, silently, but with a purpose that pulled every gaze back to her like gravity. Her fingertips brushed the edge of the folder once more. But this time, she didn't reach for papers. She reached for something heavier, something irreversible. Without lifting her eyes from Abbott, she murmured into the microphone with chilling control. "You want to talk about lies? Let me show this room what truth actually looks like." A brief nod to her aide was all it took. The lights dimmed slightly. Every camera in the chamber subtly shifted, zooming in toward the large monitor on the wall. The screen flickered to life, no introduction, no music, no editing, just raw footage. The silence in the room changed. It wasn't empty anymore. It was charged, like 1,000 breaths were being held all at once. The video opened with the unmistakable rattle of chain-link fences. The frame shook slightly. It had been taken with a hidden lens. In the background, the hum of industrial lighting buzzed faintly over the sounds of restrained movement and muffled crying. Men and women sat cramped on the floor, wrists zip-tied, heads down. One man had a bloodied rag wrapped around his hand. Another was whispering prayers under his breath. No beds, no chairs, just concrete and silence. Then came the cages. The camera panned, shakily, to a corner partitioned with metal fencing. Behind it, children, some no older than 5, some possibly teenagers. Their faces were swollen from crying, eyes red, lips cracked. A boy tried to hand his coat to a shivering girl beside him, but a guard's voice barked off camera, and the boy recoiled, frightened. In one cage, a toddler lay on a silver mylar blanket, like a discarded item in storage. And then the screen froze, paused, as if the moment itself refused to move on. A single frame remained. A little girl, no more than 6. Her hair tangled, her cheeks smeared with dirt and tears, her small hands clutching the metal bars. She stared directly into the hidden camera, not afraid, not angry, just tired. Broken in a way no child should ever be. Her voice, faint and trembling in Spanish, whispered through the speakers. "Can you tell them? I just want to see my mom." No one moved. The stillness was total, so complete it became a kind of roar. Reporters froze mid-sentence. A lawmaker dropped his pen and didn't notice. Even the security staff stopped scanning the room. The walls themselves seemed to lean inward, as if listening. Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't need to. The video had already cut deeper than any argument, any legislation, any insult ever could. It had shattered the distance between law and consequence. The screen went black, but the silence remained. It wasn't a respectful silence. It was the silence of shame, of realization, of too late understanding. Jasmine finally leaned into her mic, voice low but firm enough to slice through the stillness. "That facility is in El Paso, Texas," she said. "That footage was taken 2 weeks ago. According to the Department of Homeland Security's own report, there are over 16,000 migrant children currently detained, many without access to medical care, clean water, or even basic protection from disease." She let that number hang. 16,000. She repeated it again, slower this time. "But we only needed one little girl to remind this country what we've chosen to ignore." Abbott had been still until that moment, his mouth slightly open, his eyes flicking between the black screen and the stunned faces of the lawmakers. But now something inside him cracked, not quietly, but with fury. He lunged toward the microphone, his face a shade of red that bordered on purple. His voice burst out before he could stop himself, uncontrolled and echoing across the walls. "That video is fake," he shouted. "It's edited. It's manipulated. This is propaganda. No one should believe this garbage." His hands slammed the table. "This is a smear campaign, plain and simple," he barked again, voice trembling beneath the volume. But no one answered. No one looked away from the screen, even though it had gone dark. No one echoed his denial. The sound of his voice, angry, wild, unraveling now, sounded strangely small, distant, like it no longer belonged in the room. And above it all, the memory of the girl's voice lingered, whispering louder than Abbott could ever scream. "I just want to see my mom." The hearing room was no longer a space for debate. It had become a battleground. The image of the little girl behind the cage still lingered on the screen, like a ghost that refused to leave. Her whispered plea, "Can you tell them, I just want to see my mom," had carved silence into the walls. For one long minute, no one spoke. No one blinked. Then, like a man snapping under the weight of exposure, Greg Abbott struck back. He slammed both hands on the table, his chair screeching behind him. The microphone nearly shook from the force of his voice. "The people of Texas are under attack," he barked, spit hitting the metal as he leaned forward. "Our towns, our borders, our very way of life under invasion. And what does Crockett do?" He jabbed a finger in Jasmine's direction, fury dripping from every syllable. "She sides with the invaders. She's standing with them, not with us." The room didn't move. His voice had volume, but no weight. His words echoed but brought no energy with them. The chamber sat in still defiance, the kind that comes not from fear, but from disbelief. There were no nods of agreement. No one applauded. No one followed. He was shouting at a wall that would no longer listen. Jasmine leaned forward slowly, without breaking eye contact. Her face was calm, but her presence burned. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her words landed like a hammer. "So if a mother carrying her child away from war is an invader to you, then what does that make you, Governor, a man who calls innocent families the enemy and sends them to cages?" And then the room exploded. There was no cue, no gesture. It was instinct. The chamber erupted in a standing ovation, so forceful it sounded like thunder tearing through marble. Lawmakers rose to their feet in unison. Staffers and aides pushed back their chairs. Reporters stood with mouths open, hands clapping. Even security at the rear doors stood frozen, caught in the wave of something bigger than politics truth, finally unchained. But it wasn't over. As the applause thundered through the hearing room, the video screen behind Jasmine came alive once more. Without a word from her, her aide triggered the clip. The image grew 10 feet tall across the wall, a sequence of suffering that no one could unsee. Men cuffed to benches, children wrapped in foil blankets, a boy clutching his sister, a toilet overflowing in the corner of a cage. And finally that same little girl again, her fingers wrapped around steel, her voice barely audible but painfully clear. "Can you tell them, I just want to see my mom?" That line echoed over the speakers again, so soft, yet it drowned out everything else. The gallery fell silent mid-applause, stunned again. And then they rose higher, louder, louder still. The second ovation was no longer for Jasmine. It was for that girl, for every unseen child, for every truth buried under paperwork and politics. People were no longer clapping for a politician, they were clapping for a reckoning. Abbott sat frozen, his face flushed dark red, lips twitching, one hand gripping the table so tight his knuckles turned white. He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. The cameras zoomed in, catching every movement, every twitch, every hesitation. Then finally the words forced their way out dry, bitter, shaking. "You will pay for smearing me like this," he hissed, barely above a whisper. But his voice was no longer a threat. It was a ghost. And in a room now ruled by truth, that ghost had no power left. The chamber was still simmering in the aftermath of Jasmine's last blow when she reached back down, slowly, purposefully, and pulled out a manila envelope thicker than anything she had touched so far. She didn't rush. She didn't need to. Everyone in that room, from the top row of staffers to the lowest press assistant, could feel it in their bones. Whatever was coming next wasn't just personal, it was lethal. As she slid the envelope across the polished table, the room hushed itself into a different kind of silence, not from shock, but anticipation. She peeled it open with a single motion, then lifted the first page and held it between two fingers like it was a weapon. "Let's talk about who's getting rich," Jasmine began, her voice lower now, sharper, controlled like a knife just before it's driven in. "This is the operating agreement for Lone Star Corrections. It's not a public agency. It's a private prison contractor." She scanned the room. "They run the detention centers in Texas. Every cage, every bus, every chain. They profit on volume. The more people you lock up, the more money they make." No one dared breathe. The room was frozen in that uncanny stillness that comes when truth stops being theoretical and starts becoming dangerous. Jasmine laid down the first sheet and lifted another. This one was marked red circles, underlined blocks, timestamps. Her voice hardened. "This is a no-bid contract, awarded in the dead of night. Time-stamped 11:47 p.m. Total value $24 million. She raised her head slowly. No bidding process, no legislative review. Just a pen, just a signature. Her hand paused over the next page. "And guess what sits on Lone Star's board? A private investment fund, one that manages assets connected directly to the governor's political network." The impact was immediate. Heads turned. Murmurs rippled through the gallery. Someone near the back audibly gasped. The press pool lit up, phones raised, fingers flying. But Jasmine wasn't done. She lifted the final page, this time holding it with both hands, as if it carried the weight of everything she had been waiting to say. She turned to Abbott slowly, deliberately, and leaned in over the microphone. Her voice didn't rise. It sank. It sharpened. It bled truth. "So let me ask you, Governor." She flipped the page around so only he could see the signature circled in red. "If this company earns money every time a child is locked in a cage," she paused, eyes narrowing, "then tell this room why your name is connected indirectly or not to the people cashing those checks." The temperature in the room dropped like someone had opened a vault of ice. Every person in the chamber could feel it. This wasn't politics anymore. It was prosecution. And then Jasmine delivered the line that would haunt Abbott forever. She leaned back slightly, her voice steady, slicing through the air. Every child in those cages is a stream of money flowing into your pockets and your friends. Sever, the words didn't need echo. They carved themselves into the walls. Abbott's reaction was almost physical. His head jerked slightly, as if he'd been slapped. His hand twitched on the table. His mouth opened, then clenched shut, then opened again. Red flushed up his neck, blotching his cheeks, and then he snapped. "This is outright slander," he roared, his voice suddenly raw, almost feral. "This is a blatant lie, fabricated trash." He slammed the table so hard the microphone rattled. "You're trying to destroy me with rumors and headlines. This is a damn circus." But even as he shouted, the truth betrayed him. Because he didn't deny the documents. He didn't deny the signatures. He didn't deny the numbers. And worst of all, he didn't deny his name on the contract. The cameras caught everything. The sweat collecting above his brow. The tremor in his hands, the tightness in his voice. He was shouting like a man who knew the fire was already under his feet and Jasmine was just turning it up. The last word from Abbott hadn't even finished echoing when the ripple went far beyond the walls of Congress. Cameras across the hearing room streamed live to the national feed, and millions were already watching. On public networks, on YouTube mirrors, on breaking news push notifications, the broadcast detonated across America like a siren in the dark. In under an hour, Jasmine's video and her interrogation of Abbott had surpassed 50 million views. But this wasn't just a viral clip. This was a national gut punch, and it hit harder because it felt so real. Inside the hearing room, the energy was shifting again, not from applause this time, but from the sheer weight of public rage flooding in from outside. Protesters who had filled the steps of the Capitol since morning had passed signs into the gallery, now raised high for the cameras to catch. The words were printed in bold black ink on white poster board, but the volume came from voices chanting louder, angrier, unified. "My child is not your paycheck. My child is not your paycheck." The chant echoed off the marble like thunder. Some in the audience wept. Others held their fists in the air. Even members of Congress looked shaken. Outside the chamber, the country was split and on fire. Fox News blasted a breaking chyron across its screen. Crockett accused of betraying Texas, playing defender for illegal immigrants. One anchor stared dead into the camera and growled, "This isn't lawmaking. This is sabotage." Meanwhile, over on MSNBC, the headline read, "The Last Defender, Reper Jasmine Crockett confronts systemic corruption in historic hearing." They called her the last warrior for justice on live broadcast. A commentator declared, "This is the first time in years someone walked into Congress and said what the country was screaming." Back inside the hearing room, Greg Abbott was unraveling fast. His hands trembled as he shuffled the stack of papers in front of him, now useless shields against a flood of truth he could no longer stop. The chant, "My child is not your paycheck," grew louder every time he tried to speak. His face tightened. His shoulders rose. And then he cracked. He slammed the table again, this time not for power, but for control. "Crockett wants to destroy Texas from the inside," he shouted, voice shaking with panic. "She is undermining the state, this process, everything we've built." But even as the words poured out of him, his eyes refused to meet the cameras. He turned slightly away, angled his head down, as if trying to speak without letting the world read the truth in his face. But the world had already seen enough, and the cameras were still rolling. The air itself seemed to tighten as Jasmine leaned back slightly and gave a small nod. Her voice didn't need to lead anymore. The room moved when she moved. From the second the man stepped forward, it was clear he wasn't a politician, wasn't a lobbyist, wasn't here for show. His uniform was gone, but the fatigue still clung to him. His nameplate read Eric Delgado, and the badge imprint on his chest pocket was faint, as if scrubbed out yet still unmistakable. Eric sat down, shifted in his chair, adjusted the microphone. He looked straight ahead, not at Jasmine, not at Abbott, not at the cameras, just ahead. His hands were folded tightly, his back too straight. He cleared his throat once, but it wasn't enough to disguise the tremor in his voice. "I was employed at El Paso South facility from January of last year until 6 weeks ago," he began. "I worked 12-hour shifts, sometimes 16. I was in the juvenile wing." His words were flat at first, clinical, procedural, almost mechanical, like he had trained himself to detach. But his eyes told the truth. They blinked too often. We were told to prioritize efficiency, he continued. The more kids moved through, the better the numbers looked. But we weren't moving numbers. We were moving children. Some couldn't speak English. Some barely spoke at all. And we kept telling ourselves this is just temporary. Just hold them. Just follow the checklist. He paused. His breath caught in his chest. He looked down. But there were days that checklist made no room for dignity. A few lawmakers shifted in their seats. One staffer crossed her arms tightly, suddenly uncomfortable. The room wasn't reacting to him like a witness anymore. They were reacting to him like a mirror. Eric glanced up, hesitated, and then said quietly, "There was a week in March when the water line broke in Unit C. For 7 days, no working showers." His fingers curled slowly into fists. "We were ordered to rotate the kids through a series of 3 plastic tubs with reused water." He paused, his throat locked, and then his voice cracked. "I watched children 6, 7 years old bathe in front of each other. No dividers, no privacy. Some of them screamed. Others were just silent. They didn't even cry anymore." He swallowed hard. "They just waited their turn." His eyes glassed over as he added, "They smelled like bleach and fear." A long silence followed. No one dared interrupt him. Eric shook his head slightly, like trying to loosen something from his own memory. "I filed 3 complaints," he said, more to the table than the microphone. "No one followed up. I stopped getting scheduled. 2 weeks later, I was out." Jasmine stayed still. She didn't interrupt. She didn't comfort. She just let the truth hang in the air, unfiltered, raw, and heavy. Then she looked toward the technician booth. With a silent cue, the screen behind Eric lit up again. This time, no video. Just a single photo. The image showed a corner of the facility. The tubs. The floor stained. The curtain rod half ripped from the ceiling. And the water cloudy, murky, already used. The room stopped breathing. Senators from both sides of the aisle looked away. Aides dropped their pens. The image wasn't grainy. It wasn't pixelated. It was crystal clear. Clear enough that every viewer across the country would be able to see the bucket where America washed its conscience. Eric stared at the floor. He didn't speak again. He didn't need to. The image did the rest. Jasmine turned to the panel. Her voice, for the first time in that moment, dropped into something quieter, but far more dangerous. "If a governor believes he stands above the law," she paused, her gaze now locked on Abbott, "then the law's already dead." The words didn't explode. They didn't need to. They landed deep and unshakable. No one spoke. No one clapped. Even the cameras, so hungry just minutes ago, now felt intrusive. Every lens zoomed in on Abbott, but he didn't look up. He sat perfectly still, hands clenched so hard on the table his knuckles had gone white. His jaw was tight. His eyes stayed fixed on the wood grain beneath him. There was no response, no outrage, no deflection, just silence. Because for the first time in that hearing, he had no script left to follow. And for the first time in his career, he knew the country wasn't listening to him anymore. And while Abbott sat frozen, fists clenched and jaw locked shut, the room itself seemed to brace for impact. He thought the worst had passed, but he was wrong. The silence surrounding him didn't mean safety. It meant something bigger was coming. At the far end of the chamber, near the secure entrance usually ignored during hearings, a man stood up and adjusted the badge clipped to his lapel. He didn't speak right away. He walked calmly, confidently, to the open microphone designated for federal observers. The seal on his folder confirmed what many feared: Department of Justice. And when he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, unshaken, and devastating. "On behalf of the United States Department of Justice," he said into the mic, "we are formally opening a federal investigation into the financial relationships and operational practices surrounding Lone Star Corrections, as well as any state-level contracts connected to its activity." A few heads turned instantly. Phones came out. Cameras zoomed in. The man didn't pause. "This investigation will include scrutiny of all indirect financial ties, personal, political, or otherwise connected to Governor Abbott and his affiliated entities." For a moment, the sound was sucked out of the room. No coughs, no whispers, no murmurs. Just the audible shift in air when something irreversible begins. Abbott's eyes snapped to the DOJ representative, but his body didn't move. Not yet. His mouth tightened. His shoulders pulled back, the way a boxer does when he knows the final round isn't going his way. Then he exploded. He shoved his chair back with a screech of metal, lunged toward his microphone, and slammed his palm onto the table so hard it echoed across the hearing. "This is a political witch hunt," he roared, his voice high and shaking. "You think this is justice? It's a circus, an ambush. The DOJ's been weaponized against me from the start." His words came fast, spilling over each other, more desperate than defiant. "This isn't about facts. This is about taking down the last man who still defends the border." But the room didn't lean forward. It leaned back. Lawmakers who had once flanked him sat stone-faced. Journalists typed faster. Staffers looked at each other, unsure whether they were witnessing a political unraveling or a personal one. Abbott's voice had volume but no weight. The kind of noise that once inspired headlines now fell flat, crushed beneath the gravity of what had just been announced. He scanned the room, looking for affirmation, support, even a lifeline. But every eye stared blankly. His usual weapons, fear, fire, and fury had all misfired. He wasn't holding the narrative anymore. He was drowning in it. Jasmine didn't rush to respond. She waited for him to burn out, to exhaust the last of his deflection. And when he finally sank back into his chair, breathing heavy, sweat starting to gather at the base of his collar, she stood. Not slowly, not dramatically, just with calm, absolute control. Her voice didn't need to rise. It didn't shout. It sliced. "If you're not afraid of the truth," she said, her tone sharp enough to freeze the air, "then let the American people see it in the daylight." She turned to the panel, not just Republicans or Democrats, but all of them. Because truth doesn't need to hide behind locked doors, but corruption always does. There it was. One sentence, one pivot, and the weight of the room moved again. People didn't erupt in applause. They didn't need to. The silence was deeper this time, not hollow but filled with recognition. Jasmine had just done what no one in power expected her to do. She had brought the people back into the room, not with fire, not with insults, but with truth that couldn't be spun. Abbott slumped slightly in his chair, fingers still gripping the table, as if letting go would mean falling apart entirely. His face had gone pale, the redness that fueled his earlier rage replaced with something emptier. Shame? Maybe. Maybe just exhaustion. His lips pressed together, forming the beginning of another response. But then he stopped. He knew it wouldn't matter, because in that moment, no one was waiting to hear from him. They were all still listening to her. The cameras didn't move off Jasmine. The network Chiron had already updated. DOJ launches investigation into Texas governor. And the clip of her words, "Let the American people see it in the daylight," was already trending. Reporters whispered that this wasn't just a hearing anymore. It was a reckoning. One aide in the back of the room said quietly, "That's it. That's the turning point." Another leaned in and whispered, "He knows it too." Abbott wiped his hand across his mouth, slowly, his shoulders no longer squared. His tie had come loose. His knuckles remained white against the wood. But this time no one asked him to speak, and he didn't, because everything that needed to be said had already been said, and none of it had come from him. The storm didn't end in the hearing room. It exploded into every courthouse, every newsroom, every locked hallway the state thought would never be opened. On Wednesday at exactly 10:43 a.m., the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Texas released a ruling that would tear through the foundation of SB 4 like a controlled demolition. The announcement came with no press conference, no leaks, no warning, just a digital PDF uploaded to the court's docket, but it might as well have been a bomb. Effective immediately, a portion of Senate Bill 4 is hereby suspended pending constitutional review, the statement read. Federal Judge Denise Albright didn't mince words. Her decision cited substantial evidence of potential civil rights violations and systemic harm, referencing directly the video and witness testimonies presented by Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett. Within 10 minutes, the ruling spread like fire across social media, major news outlets, and Texas political circles. Inside the Capitol, the air changed. Phones buzzed in every office. Law clerks sprinted between chambers. Legal analysts on MSNBC broke down the order live, labeling it an early but seismic blow to the Abbott administration. But it wasn't just the legal community reacting, it was the families, migrant advocates, civil rights groups, church leaders, educators, parents. Finally, one mother in Austin whispered to a local station, clutching a photo of her 13-year-old son detained last month. Finally, someone sees us. The judge's ruling did more than just pause enforcement. It opened locked gates, literally. In Section 3C of the order, a single sentence changed everything. All detention facilities under SB 4 contracts are to grant immediate access to federally appointed inspectors, unannounced and unrestricted. That line alone triggered an overnight scramble across Texas. At Lone Star Corrections in Dilley, guards were seen calling their supervisors in a panic. In McAllen, the warden posted a handwritten sign at the gate, closed until further notice. It didn't matter. U.S. Marshals arrived at dawn with printed warrants and digital copies on iPads. No arguments, no deals. "Step aside," one officer said calmly. "We're not here for your permission." As the sun rose over the Rio Grande Valley, news helicopters hovered above the rust-stained fences and corrugated roofs of the detention centers. From above, they looked like warehouses. From inside, they looked worse. Cameras captured footage of inspectors walking through long, dim hallways with peeling paint and rows of makeshift bunks. One child looked straight into the lens, then looked away. Another clutched a paper cup, too tired to stand. Federal agents moved room by room. They documented exposed wiring, broken plumbing, flooded showers, and storage closets packed with expired medical supplies. But what shook even the seasoned inspectors wasn't the infrastructure. It was the silence. Children sat in neat rows, not crying, not yelling, just watching, as if they'd already learned that noise didn't change anything. One inspector from the Office of Civil Rights paused mid-report, wiped her eyes, and said quietly, "This is worse than anything I saw overseas." By 3 p.m., Judge Albright issued a second motion. All inspection findings would be published within 10 days, unedited, unsealed, unclassified. No redactions, no filters. The public deserves full visibility into the conditions funded by taxpayer dollar, she wrote. Anything less would be a continuation of the harm. The Abbott administration tried to push back. Their legal team filed a motion to delay the inspections, claiming they needed time to clarify federal jurisdiction boundaries. The judge denied it within the hour. Then they tried to claim the facilities were under state emergency management protocols. That was denied too. One Department of Justice lawyer was overheard saying, "They can't hide behind bureaucracy anymore. The veil is off." Inside the governor's mansion, sources said Abbott was fuming not just at the court, but at his own advisors. "Who the hell let it get this far?" he reportedly yelled. But it was already too late. The images were out. The reports were coming. The eyes of the country were now fixed on buildings once kept in the shadows. There was no PR strategy that could erase that. Back in D.C., Jasmine Crockett stood quietly in her office, watching the live broadcast of federal agents unlocking gates. No speeches, no celebration, just quiet resolve. A staffer turned to her and asked, "How do you feel?" Jasmine didn't look away from the screen. She just said, "Like we're finally forcing the truth to step into the light." And yet the gates opening was just the beginning. What came next wasn't law. It was reckoning. By Friday morning, the Capitol buzzed with anticipation. Jasmine Crockett was scheduled to address a joint session of Congress, an event that had rarely drawn such a crowd since the impeachment hearings. Cameras were already rolling. Journalists elbowed for space in the balcony. Protesters gathered outside, some holding signs that simply read, "Light, Truth, Dignity." Inside the chamber, the silence was thick. Members of both parties sat still, eyes fixed on the woman who had become the unwilling symbol of a country's conscience. Jasmine Crockett walked up the steps slowly, not for drama, but with the weight of something sacred. Not just pain, not just truth, but a burden no one else seemed ready to carry. She took the podium, no teleprompter, no notes. Her voice was calm, but each word landed like a strike of lightning. "I didn't come here to win," she began, eyes scanning the rows of elected officials. "I came here so that no one else would have to be invisible because of their skin color or their papers." For a moment, the room didn't breathe. No one clapped. No one blinked. Jasmine wasn't asking for applause. She was naming something too many had been paid to ignore. She continued, her voice growing stronger. This wasn't about left or right. It was about a system that counts the votes of the privileged, but buries the silence of the powerless. A system that profits off detention, that sells pain in contracts and calls it security. A system that locked up children and then dared to call it law. A Republican senator shifted uncomfortably. Another turned away. But Jasmine didn't flinch. "This is not about me. This is about a janitor in El Paso who hasn't seen his wife in 18 months because of an ice hold. It's about a teenager who missed her high school graduation because she spent it behind a barbed wire fence. It's about an old woman in Laredo who died waiting for her court date." The room had no words, only silence, and it was the kind of silence that finally felt honest. She stepped back slightly from the microphone, eyes blazing but unshaken. "If the truth makes you uncomfortable, maybe it's time you asked why you were ever comfortable with the lie?" In the media booth, one CNN producer whispered, "Jesus, replay that." In real time, her words were being clipped, captioned, subtitled, translated. Broadcasts in over 20 countries ran with the headline, "Crockett's speech sparks national reckoning." And outside, under the overcast sky of D.C., something else was happening. For the first time in weeks, Governor Greg Abbott avoided the press. The man who had once pounded podiums with fiery declarations now kept his distance, sunglasses on, lips pressed tight. Reporters chased him down a side corridor of the Capitol, throwing questions like darts. "Governor, do you stand by SB 4? Do you deny the footage from the detention centers? Are you still claiming this is a political stunt?" He didn't stop. He didn't blink. He just muttered, "No comment." Gone was the booming rhetoric. Gone was the smirk. All that remained was a man shadowed by his own policies, cornered by the truth he'd spent years trying to bury. The clip went viral in minutes. Jasmine, meanwhile, didn't bask in the moment. She returned to her seat in the chamber, eyes still focused forward. Her staff tried to hand her a phone showing trending tags. Crockett truth, chartered end SB4. Rasha, we see them. She barely glanced. This wasn't a victory lap. This was the midpoint of a war she never wanted, but refused to walk away from. A few feet away, a veteran congressman leaned toward his aide and whispered, "She just did in 5 minutes what we couldn't do in 5 decades." The aide didn't respond. He was too busy wiping away a tear. Later that evening, as the chamber emptied and the marble halls echoed with footsteps, Jasmine lingered alone at the podium for a few seconds. Her fingers touched the wood where so many had spoken before her, most of them men, most of them untouched by the stories she carried. And in that quiet moment, as the weight of the entire day settled on her shoulders, she looked into the near-empty room and said what no one else dared. How many more systems in this country are surviving off the silence of people who have no voice? The question wasn't aimed at anyone, and yet it hung in the air like thunder. That one question, spoken not into a microphone, but into the bones of a broken system, did not stay inside the Capitol. It ricocheted across America like a siren. Within 48 hours, Jasmine Crockett's words were no longer just a congressional moment. They were a national litmus test. And the first to feel the heat weren't politicians. They were corporations. In Colorado, the governor held a press conference at sunrise, flanked by immigration advocates and human rights attorneys. The state would immediately begin terminating all contracts with private detention centers. "We will not be complicit in systems that profit from pain," he declared, holding up a file of shredded agreements. Cheers erupted outside the Capitol building. Inside, legal teams began reviewing dozens of policy clauses, many of which had been rubber-stamped in silence for decades. By noon, Illinois followed, then New Mexico, then Washington. It wasn't just political momentum, it was moral momentum. States weren't just reacting to media pressure. They were reacting to something deeper: shame. Shame that it took one woman, one microphone, and one unflinching moment of truth to expose what they'd been pretending not to see. In each of these states, headlines blared. Private prisons under fire after Crockett bombshell. From detention to accountability, Jasmine's speech sparks nationwide reform. But the effects weren't just felt on American soil. Thousands of miles away in Geneva, the United Nations Human Rights Council held an emergency session. Delegates from 17 countries demanded clarity on U.S. border practices. The most scathing rebuke came from a South African envoy who addressed the American delegation directly. "You preach freedom abroad," he said coldly, while letting detention quotas dictate justice at home. The room was still. The American representative flipped through a binder and gave no response. Shortly after, the UN formally submitted a request. The United States was to launch an immediate and independent review of all federal and state-level immigration detention policies. The pressure wasn't just diplomatic, it was historical. This was the first time in over 20 years that the U.S. faced such a directive over its domestic treatment of migrants. International papers lit up. In France, Le Monde called it La Tempête de Texas, the Texas storm. In Berlin, Die Zeit ran a black and white front page of Jasmine's face beneath the caption, "One voice broke the silence." Back in the UK, The Guardian ran an op-ed titled, "America's Conscience Now Has a Name, Crockett." Even traditionally conservative outlets couldn't ignore the shift. Sky News ran a segment titled, "Capitol Confrontation Becomes Global Wake-Up Call," showing footage from Jasmine's speech intercut with haunting clips from inside the West Texas facilities. They didn't blur the bruises. They didn't cut the screams. They let the footage speak. Inside the U.S., Wall Street firms began reviewing investment ties to private prison operators. Stock in two of the largest detention contractors dropped by 29% in a single day. Board members scrambled for talking points, but the damage was already done. In a viral video that circulated on TikTok and Instagram, a college student summed it up best. "This isn't cancel culture, this is consequence culture." Meanwhile, Jasmine remained focused. She declined interview requests from 60 Minutes, The View, even BBC World News. Her response was simple. "This isn't about sound bites, it's about survivors." At the Department of Homeland Security, mid-level officials were panicking. Email chains leaked to journalists showed urgent discussions about possible restructuring and whistleblower protections. One internal message read, "If we don't get ahead of this narrative, we're going to lose control of the story and the system." But they were already too late. The story was no longer theirs to control. Activists held candlelight vigils outside nearly every known private detention facility across 18 states. Survivors spoke. Family members cried. In El Paso, a 9-year-old boy held up a sign that read, "I want my mom back." Reporters sobbed. Officers looked away. Back in Texas, the ripple turned into a landslide. County after county voted to halt new contracts with immigration enforcement agencies. Judges began fast-tracking cases that had languished in silence. A small-town sheriff who had once defended the SB4 enforcement measures on live radio quietly submitted his resignation. No farewell speech, just a folded flag in a sealed letter. Even inside Congress, longtime holdouts began to change their tone. One Republican senator who had previously backed private detention funding stood at a press conference and said, "I voted for that bill because I thought it made us safer. I was wrong." That clip, just 7 seconds long, was played on loop across networks from CNN to Al Jazeera. Not because of its drama, but because of its rarity. An admission, a break in the machine, and the machine kept breaking. In a small office in Sacramento, a former detainee turned attorney filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of 143 migrants who had been forcibly separated from their families under SB4. The case gained instant attention. Legal scholars called it the next Brown v. Board. And all across America, people asked one question with growing clarity. If it took this much noise to end one policy in one state, how many other policies are still hiding in silence? It wasn't just a reckoning, it was an awakening. And at the heart of it all stood a congresswoman from Texas who never raised her voice, never flinched, and never asked for a title, only for a country to finally look itself in the mirror. And just when the legal dust began to settle, when the courtrooms had emptied and the headlines started to fade, something else took hold. Not a ruling, not a vote, but a moment that reminded everyone watching that, behind all the policies, numbers, and statistics, there were children. Real children. And one of them had something to say. The letter was creased at the edges, hand-folded in a way that showed it had been opened and closed more than once. A staffer handed it to Jasmine quietly, almost reverently, as if they all knew this wasn't just paper, it was memory. It was truth. Jasmine held it for a second, her thumb running over the faint ink. Then she stood up, walked to the microphone, and with no dramatic pause began to read. "Thank you," she said, her voice clear but soft. "I still remember your eyes that day." The room went silent. Not political silence, not respectful silence, but the kind that swallows everything else, where even the air seems to wait. Members of Congress, aides, reporters, even the security guards at the door, all froze as the weight of those words settled like dust on stone. It was from a little girl in Guatemala, 9 years old, detained at the border, ripped from her aunt in the dead of night. Jasmine had visited the facility undercover 2 years earlier. She hadn't spoken much then, just walked the halls. Locked eyes with children who'd forgotten what a kind face looked like. She didn't know that among them was a girl who would never forget hers. Jasmine looked up, blinking away whatever threatened to fall. "She remembered my eyes," she said. "Not my name, not my title, not my questions. My eyes." A tremor rippled through the room. It wasn't weakness, it was the unbearable honesty that followed. That in a system built on steel doors and concrete floors, what broke through was not power, but presence. Then Jasmine took a breath, not just to steady herself, but to sharpen what came next. "I didn't come here to win," she said, her voice now rising like a storm breaking out of the clouds. "I came here so no one else would have to disappear because of their skin, or their papers, or their silence." People didn't clap. This wasn't a campaign rally, but something shifted. Some leaned forward, some dropped their pens, some swallowed hard. In a place where performance often drowned out truth, Jasmine had just reminded them that real justice doesn't wear makeup. It bleeds. It remembers. And sometimes it speaks through the smallest, softest voices, the kind you wouldn't even hear unless you chose to stop and listen. For the first time in hours, no one tried to interrupt her, not even her loudest opponents. By the time she stepped back, even the opposition didn't move. Abbott, once booming with defiance, had nothing left to shout. His last appearance to the press was a grim walk past the cameras, muttering only, "No comment." But the silence said enough. The man who built his brand on control now looked like someone who had seen something he couldn't explain and couldn't erase. Outside, the crowds didn't chant. They listened. Screens replayed the letter. News anchors couldn't fill the silence fast enough. And in living rooms across America, a different kind of question began to surface. Not about politics, not about laws, but about complicity. How many systems across this country survive on the silence of those who have no voice? How many children remember eyes that never returned? How many judges, lawmakers, and executives hide behind the armor of legality while others are punished just for existing? That day, Jasmine Crockett didn't just close a hearing, she opened a reckoning, one that didn't end in applause, one that didn't need a hashtag, because the people watching weren't looking for headlines anymore. They were looking for mirrors, and Jasmine, whether she knew it or not, had become one. Somewhere in El Paso, that little girl, now 11, was watching the replay on a donated tablet in a foster center's common room. She saw her own handwriting on the screen. She heard her words. She smiled, not because everything had changed, but because someone had remembered, because someone had spoken, because someone had finally said no to cruelty dressed up as policy, and that more than any vote, any ruling, or any soundbite is where Jasmine's real journey begins. And as the room fell silent, after the last word of the child's letter echoed into the chamber like a bell tolling for forgotten justice, something deeper began to settle. It wasn't applause, it wasn't outrage. It was a stillness heavy enough to suffocate. For just a second, no one knew what to say. Not the senators, not the attorneys, not the lobbyists who had sat smug for hours, because in that one line, "Thank you, I still remember the way you looked at me that day. Every layer of legality, of procedure, of cold political distance collapsed like paper soaked in gasoline, burned not by flame, but by truth. This wasn't about just one child. It was never about just one detention center. This was about the lie that had taken root so deep inside the American system that people had stopped recognizing it as a lie. That you can treat people like numbers and still call it justice. That cruelty, if done through policy, is somehow less cruel. But Jasmine Crockett cracked that illusion wide open. Not by screaming, not by dramatics, but by letting a little girl's handwritten truth do what no press conference ever could remind this nation what it feels like to be human again. Because the real enemy isn't just the law, it's the silence that lets it operate unchallenged. It's the shrug, the passive voice, the politician who says, "It's complicated," while children are locked in rooms too cold to sleep. The bureaucrat who signs off on another contract with a private prison, then goes home to a family untouched by cages. Jasmine didn't walk into that chamber to change a policy. She walked in to dismantle a machine one built on the belief that no one would care enough to stop it. But they didn't expect someone like her. She didn't come from a political dynasty. She didn't wear a last name like armor. She came from fire, from fight, from the kind of pain you don't learn in law school. And that's what made her dangerous. Because when a woman like that sees a little girl from Guatemala look at her like she's the only lifeline left, that woman doesn't just testify. She declares war on every excuse that's ever been used to justify suffering in the name of order. And here's what made this moment different. Jasmine didn't just challenge the system, she exposed the people who had built careers defending it. They couldn't look her in the eye. They couldn't answer her questions. They couldn't deny the letter because it wasn't a statistic. It wasn't hearsay. It was the kind of truth that cuts across party lines, across language, across every shield they tried to hide behind. It was a child remembering kindness in a room built to erase it. So what's the lesson? It's not abstract. It's not poetic. It's brutal. If your government requires children to suffer in silence to function efficiently, then your system is not broken. It is evil. If your law needs loopholes to hide its violence, then your law is not worthy of obedience. And if your justice only works for the powerful, then it's not justice at all. Jasmine didn't say these things out loud. She didn't have to. The letter said them for her, and that's what made it lethal. Too often, stories like this end with a pat on the back, a quote about hope, a promise that change is coming. But Jasmine didn't offer closure. She didn't ask for forgiveness or applause. She offered a mirror, one that forced every American to ask, what did I ignore to feel comfortable? What injustice did I call normal just because it came dressed in paperwork and policy memos? And maybe the most devastating truth of all, that little girl should have been forgotten. By design. That's what the system counted on. That people like her disappear into files, transferred between agencies like freight, never to be seen or remembered again. But she remembered Jasmine. She remembered her eyes. That means something. That means one moment of decency, one refusal to look away, was powerful enough to stay etched in a child's memory after everything else was taken from her. So now we're left with a choice. We can pretend this was a story about heroism, about one brave woman against the machine. Or we can face the harder truth, that Jasmine shouldn't have had to be brave in the first place, that no child should need a congresswoman's intervention to be treated like a human being, that a nation built on liberty shouldn't need a viral hearing to realize cages don't belong anywhere near a child. Jasmine's story doesn't end here, because she never wanted to be the final chapter. She wanted to be the spark, the voice that reminded others how to find their own. And her message wasn't complicated, it was blisteringly simple. If the law is weaponized to hurt the weak, then the moral duty is to break that law with your voice, your vote, your body if you have to. Because silence isn't neutral. Silence is how injustice survives. And when we look back on this moment years from now, we won't remember the legislation. We won't remember the names of the people who sat quietly and nodded. We'll remember the moment a girl said thank you, the moment a room full of lawmakers heard a voice they were never meant to hear, and the moment Jasmine Crockett decided that a country's soul is measured not by how it treats its strongest, but how it protects its most invisible. This is the real takeaway. You don't need to be a lawmaker to change laws. You don't need a title to hold power accountable. All you need is the courage to say, I see you, when the world tells you to look away. That's what Jasmine gave us. Not a verdict, not a headline, but a blueprint for resistance. And the next time a child is forced to write a thank you letter to a stranger just for being kind, that letter should not be rare. It should be unnecessary, because kindness should not be revolutionary. It should be expected. And justice should not depend on who's watching. It should be written into every action, every rule, every heartbeat of a government that dares to call itself free. Jasmine Crockett didn't save America that day, but she reminded it what saving looks like. And if we were listening closely, we heard the real verdict loud and clear. If you were born with a microphone, learn to listen before you use it, because the truth doesn't come with an edit button. But truth, no matter how powerful in a courtroom, means nothing unless it lives outside of it. Jasmine Crockett didn't fight so people could watch and applaud. She fought so we'd stop watching and start moving. This was never meant to be a spectacle. It was a spark. And now the question that burns in every silent pause is simple. What are you going to do about it? You don't need a seat in Congress to fight like Jasmine. You don't need a microphone or a national headline. You need the guts to call cruelty what it is. You need the fire to look someone in the eye when they hide behind "it's just policy" and say, that's not good enough. Start local. Sit in on school board meetings. Ask where your city's contracts go. Volunteer with immigrant advocacy groups. Don't let these moments pass like entertainment. Let them move you into action. And when someone tries to dismiss your voice because you're too young, too poor, too angry, too black, too brown, too loud, remember what Jasmine taught in silence. One look, one refusal to flinch, one person who stands in front of the system and dares to say, no more. That's all it takes to begin the change. Every revolution starts with one person who refuses to shrink. So write, speak, organize. Vote like someone's life depends on it, because it does. Challenge every policy that dehumanizes in the name of order. Push back when they say, this is just how it's always been. Demand better, because laws don't change themselves. People do, and those people are not mythical heroes. They are mothers, teachers, students, workers, people like you. In the end, this isn't Jasmine's story to carry alone. It's a baton passed in real time. Pick it up. Don't drop it, because the fight isn't over. The real hearing is out here now in our homes, our streets, our schools. And the next child looking for hope won't be watching C-SPAN. They'll be watching you. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.